Hi everybody. In this video tutorial, I want to take a look at the creation of this scene in D5 render. I'll explain how I built the overall structure within SketchUp. I'll give you some advice on what to do and what not to do, and we'll look at how to set up the scene in D5 render. I'll explain the lighting setup and just give you some advice and some tips on how to manage your scene. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody. So the first step is actually one that's often overlooked, and that is getting some inspiration. Sometimes people will use things like mood boards, but really I find a great source for ideas is just going to Pinterest and just searching for something. The joy of Pinterest is that you can just click on anything and sort of go down an inspirational rabbit hole. We know that what we're trying to design or build is a Victorian conservatory, which is basically a fancy glass house. And so that's what we've gone and searched for. And you can see it's easy enough to just click on something and kind of just take some design inspiration. The other option is to just use a Google image search, and you can see you can do that. We know that we want to build something that kind of resembles this, maybe looks a little bit more modern, but by and large is really just built around the idea of a sort of Victorian style interior garden. And there's a lot you can get from just doing a quick Google image search. Now, the second thing is going to be your color palette or the overall color scheme. Now, this is Adobe Color. I'll probably do a bigger video on this later. Oftentimes, you may just go to Adobe Color and see something that looks like this. This is the default color wheel. And a lot of people might not actually go any further than this and think it's just a color wheel. But there's some really great stuff here. If we go to Trends, we can actually see what's going on in really just different areas of the web. You can see that what it's doing is pulling from Behance and Adobe Stock. And it's effectively looking at those images and pulling the color themes from them. Now, what's really great is we can also go down here to the architecture one and then go to the right and click View More. And you can see now, we've got a huge array of sort of pre-made color schemes that we can adopt. I know that my final color scheme is already going to be white and green. It's one that I use quite a lot of, and I just like the visuals of it. I think it reads very well. But if you're just starting out and you want something that's a little bit different, strongly recommend that you gather some inspiration first. Pinterest, Google image searches, and then finding a color scheme from Adobe Color. And you can get some really, really nice ideas here. All right, let's move on. The next step is the construction of your actual build within SketchUp. And so what's really important here is that you keep the default SketchUp scale character. They'll usually be right here when you start up a new SketchUp scene. Now, that will give you an idea of an internal logical scale. All right, this building may seem complicated, but let's break it down into its separate pieces. In order to figure out the layout, I'm going to hide all of these bits here. You can see that once we've got the overall floor plan established, I've gone ahead and drawn the design or patterns where I know the foliage is going to be. And in my case, really all I did was use the arc tool to just draw a wide variety of lines and then use the line tool to just draw a grid pattern. Now, mine was a little bit organic in nature, which is a fancy way of saying I hadn't really planned out anything at all. And so the shapes and patterns that came from it are very organically formed, and I actually would not recommend you do that going forward. If I was to redo this again, I'd really think a lot more about the actual layout and the flow for where I want the garden beds to be. You can see I ended up with quite a number of disparate elements here, pieces that aren't really attached to anything cohesively. And at the end of the day, it worked visually, but in terms of functionally, this is not great. Try and avoid having areas like this section here, right in front of the camera, where maybe the pathway is just a little bit too narrow to be feasible. But once that's done, go ahead and use the push-pull tool to give edges. And you can combine the push-pull tool and the offset tool in SketchUp to effectively just provide this little border trim. If we look at this in D5, I've gone ahead and placed the display mode to just the smooth. You can see here, this is the border edges around each section. For the window elements, the simplest way to approach this is to use groups or components, whichever you're more comfortable with. I would recommend using components for this because once you edit one, the changes will be updated. So to do this, let's just start by grabbing a rectangle, and you can just draw your pattern directly on this rectangle. You could also try drawing it on just half and then duplicating the second half and welding them, but honestly, it might be just a little bit easier to use the default tools. And so I would just use a combination of just the regular line or pen tool and just draw out the overall shape and design for your window. You can use the arc tool to add effectively just curved tops to the windows. This will help with that sort of Victorian look that we're going for. By drawing a complicated surface and then using the offset tool, you can get a pretty nice result. Now, one thing I do recommend here before you start using push-pull though, is to preemptively go in and color code the different parts. So for example, the areas that is going to be glass, let's go in here and actually put glass on that before we go too far. And then the areas that are going to be metal, and because we're going for a sort of a Victorian look, you want to make sure that these bits, let's go ahead and put those to maybe dark, something kind of black maybe, not so dark that you can't see it. That'll work just fine. And then we can use the push-pull tool. You want to make sure you're set to the alternative push-pull tool. So hit Control and just lift up the frame. And there you go. Depending on the complexity of your actual window and depending on how many windows you have in there, this is something that will give you a result that looks a little bit like this. You can always go in further and clean this up if you want, but it's just nice to ensure that each part of the window has thickness, and especially the metal frame has an element of thickness. This will really help sell the realism. Moving on to the roof. Really here what we're talking about is basically just the truss system, and that's this right here. Now, this can seem really complicated, but please note that complexity comes from simple designs just replicated. So if we go into this group here, you can see I've actually just got two different truss systems in place. And so in order to get these, you can just go to the warehouse and search. And so I'm going to do TRUSS. All right, just search for 1S. There we go. And you can see you've got some really, really nice pre-built ones. I use some from this Medique Engineering Inc. and just bring these in, explode them, remove the parts that really don't match or don't look good for your design. They are really good, by the way. But, you know, we're going for aesthetics over functionality here, so it doesn't have to be physically accurate. And so bring in your truss system, and then I brought in an additional truss system. And you can see by layering and grouping and then multiplying these in an array, you can get the illusion of complexity. Now, are they structurally sound? Probably not. And are they construction accurate? No. But overall, the effect looks really, really good. And you can see that if we go onto the ground level here in SketchUp, you get a very nice impression. Now, once that's done, I added in some additional support columns here just to make the building look a little bit more feasible. And after that, I use some just repeating elements like these effectively concrete pillars to close out the ends, just to make everything as seamless. Really, we're not trying to hide any of the construction here. You want everything to be sort of visible. Now, the other thing you need to be mindful of once that's all done is color coding everything correctly. And this will take a very, very long time. In order for D5 to recognize that each piece is its own piece, it should be correctly color coded. And you can see that, for example, on the outside wall here, which is sort of the privacy wall or retaining wall, this is really just going to hide the horizon line in D5. That had to be set to its own specific color. You can use a drop-down menu here and use colors, and I also use colors named as well. I don't really think that it makes much difference in D5 whether you use a texture or just assign a random color. I think either way the result will be the same. You just need to do this very, very carefully so that you don't get reused materials being used on the wrong sections. All right, moving on. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching the video. Really do appreciate it. And if you would like to maybe like comment or hit the like button and all that stuff, please go ahead. Thank you so much for watching. So here we are in D5. The first thing we'll want to do is not think about the fine details. We always want to work big to small. And this is true of whether you're doing, you know, an ArcViz project or doing like a ZBrush sculpt or really any sort of 3D work, always thinking big to small first. So forget about the foliage and the greenery and just concentrate on the overall big materials. In the areas that I know I'm going to be placing foliage, I have put a default ground material, and pretty much every asset, I believe, for this shot did come from the D5 library. So we've got basically just ground. This is just going to be clay in the flower beds. I did add a large tile, and I'm going to move myself out of the way here. And the tile on the floor, I have made this a little bit more reflective. It's kind of unlikely, realistically, that you would put like a very shiny marble floor in a room like this. You'd probably go for something like tile, but it looks really, really nice to my mind. And so I placed that there. I've also put a different, I think it's granite tile that runs around the perimeter of the beds. Now, for me, it was important that there's a distinction in materials between these, and that's why I've gone for a much darker material here. And this will provide some nice visual contrast. Now, for the metal work, I've gone for just really the same material. This is a standard default D5 just black metal material. And I have also then just duplicated and converted it to white. So I've got effectively a black and white color scheme going on. And you could try different experimentations with this. You could do all black rafters or all white, whatever kind of mood you're going for. But I think the black and white gives it a bit of contrast, and that looked pretty nice to my mind. On the outside wall, which was effectively sort of this partition wall, this is just placed to hide the horizon line, and I just put again a default brick or stone material. When it comes to placing these assets, I want to talk a little bit about that. And so I'm going to go over here and turn on my hero shrubs. And you can see when I do that, I've got some really large shrubbery in this section right here. Now, how do we go about actually building this? Well, the approach that I would recommend is, again, modularity. So what we do is we think about in terms of the readability of this. In other words, partially how it visually looks, but also if you were planting this in real life, you'd like to have a staggered or kind of layered approach. So pick a section, pretty much a small section like this. I think I did something similar to this right here, you know, really about maybe 6 feet by 6 feet or 2 meters by 2 meters, just a small area. And you will go ahead and create your scene. So I've placed some larger trees at the back, some medium-sized bushes, and then the smaller plants at the front. Now, you'll also want to offset these a little bit. They should look organized and organic, but not rigidly placed. You don't want these to look like little Lego plants that are placed right in front of a house or right in front of the camera. They should work quite nicely together. Leave some gaps, but also make sure that it looks a little planted, so it's not perfectly lined up. Once you have that, you can hold down Control, left click, and drag out a selection. And once you have your selection made, you can group it. So we can maybe group it, or we can just duplicate it by holding down Shift and drag this out. And once you do that, you can actually find yourself really planting, if you will, large areas of greenery and foliage pretty quickly. Now, you're going to find strange gaps and where things don't line up perfectly. That's totally fine. We're also going to be adding in some rocks. Now, I added in the rocks afterwards. I probably would recommend maybe doing that before. Just put in these rocks in the ground here, just so the thing looks a little bit more natural. It wouldn't just really be all brown like this. It's very unlikely that the ground, even in a conservatory or garden, is going to be perfectly flat like this. So add in some rocks and then do this little trick with the greenery. And I think that will plant pretty efficiently. So that took care of this whole section very, very quickly. On the right side, I did the same technique, only this time we're using basically a herb garden, or herb if you're American. And that's just going to line up right here as well. Let's turn that on. There we go. And you can see the same color scheme, different plants. So same methodology, just working large to medium to small. Have the hero plants, the ones you want to have the most visual appeal, close to the curb effectively. And if we look at my first scene, you can see that's the effect that we've got going. One thing I did want in this was to have some very pronounced hero elements. And in this case, the trees at the back. Now, if I was doing this again, I would strongly recommend that you figure out before you get to this point where you want your primary focus, your main sort of hook, if you will, to the image. Now, in my case, it ended up being way at the back of the conservatory. So my advice would be don't do what I did. Put that more prominently and maybe have it more centrally focused. This might be where it could pay off to maybe look into maybe some articles on how to lay out a garden or lay out your trees. And I didn't really have that background, so I kind of just threw stuff in. So think a little bit more, plan it out a little bit better than I did. Now, on top of our hero shrubs, we also have some other things as well. And again, you're going for basically something that, you know, really is visually appealing and eye-catching. And so I'm going to turn on all my layers here. And there we go. And this is what I was looking for, which is this tree right here. And so this is effectively the focal point of a lot of the scenes. Let's go back to scene 1. And you can see this large tree right back here. The other thing when it came to adding some trees in, I did add trees on each corner, and you can see that on the top right here. That really just gives a nice overhang effect for the images. And I also added in some tree or foliage variation, and that's where we get these sort of yellow trees right here, just to break up the sea of kind of white and green. Once that was done, we were in a pretty good spot. We could concentrate on some of the smaller beds. So let's turn off these again. And we already took a look at some of the sort of beds earlier. So I'm just going to scooch forward here a little bit. So you can see here, when it comes to this section up here, the succulents and rocks, this is something that I really enjoyed doing. But again, the lack of planning on the floor plan, you can kind of see it right here. You're going to run into problems where the edges don't line up. So again, my advice would be to plan out the floor plan just a little bit better than what I did. You can see we're getting some unnatural sharpness here as well. All in all though, the succulent section was actually very, very enjoyable. Again, we're just using default assets that come with D5. And the whole crux of this was that each section of this interior conservatory would have its own elements. The last thing that I added was some of the decorative artwork. Now, the lights were just plopped into the scene on the default level. They do emit light because they're very good D5 assets, but the statue work was just grabbed from the D5 library. And you can see here, they're really just in there to add something of visual interest, another little element or hook that might grab the viewer's attention. And so if you envision people walking around this scene in real life, it's just nice to come across sculptural work within a garden. And so there's 2 or 3 placed in these shots. Let's click on scene 2 here. And you can see it'll resemble something a little bit like that. We also have added in some other elements, furniture, and just some other little things like that you would expect to see in a usable or lived-in space. But you can see the statues over here on the left as well. All right, let's move on. One thing to keep in mind when working on a scene like this that has a lot of foliage is going to be scene management. If you look here on the left, you can see where I have everything on its own layer. Try and work with things organized logically on their own layers, and also try and name the layers. Now, my naming convention here is a little bit sort of just for me, but if you want it to work cleanly, I'd strongly recommend that you label everything correctly and accurately. Now, you may also find that some things like my lights over here did end up just randomly on their own sort of like not a specific layer. That does happen, but hopefully if you do it right, everything will be arranged correctly. Layers can be toggled on and off, and this will make working within D5 a lot smoother. And this is true depending on whether you've got really good hardware or average-ish or poor hardware. It doesn't really matter. Layer organization will help you out a lot. In order to light this, I did use a HDRI. You can see this is from this Kloppenheim 06. This is from the website polyhaven.com. Longtime users of D5 will be familiar with Polyhaven, but if you're not aware, Polyhaven is a great repository of HDRI images that you can use to light your D5 scenes. One thing to be mindful of, HDRI images can come with just the sky, which is what you can see on the top right here, or it can come with showing buildings in the environment. You want to make sure that if you're going to use a sky and a HDRI image like this to light your D5 scene, make sure that you're only using ones that have the sky. You don't want to see a kind of distorted image of a building in the background. Just something to be mindful of. You can adjust the light and the rotation of the HDRI to suit whatever scene you're going for, but please also remember to turn off the auto exposure. This is super important. You do want to set the exposure of your D5 render scene really by eye. You don't necessarily want to turn this on and work. You could probably get some okay images with this, but for real control, you want to make sure that you are controlling the exposure. So turn off the auto exposure. I've left pretty much everything else intact. You can adjust the highlights, but that has a tendency to blow out the image a little bit. And you can adjust the shadows, which is obviously the sort of darker parts of the image. Generally, I found leaving the slope, which is the mid values at the default, should work fine for most of your scenes. One other thing to be mindful of, if you're using the HDRI, you can also add an additional sun. I like the overall look of this HDRI image here. Let's go back to scene 1. And you can kind of see if I adjust this, by the way, this icon right here is going to do effectively the cut off. It will cut through your image. So you can see, there we go. And I'm going to just make sure that my depth of field is turned off. And there we go. That should bring everything back to clarity. But the additional sun here will allow you to add more light. So I love the overall look and feel of this HDRI image, but it was still a little bit dark. Turning on the additional sun will allow you to blast extra light into your scene. You can tie this, by the way, to the HDRI, or you can have it set to your own custom height and location. But generally, it makes more sense to leave it on, follow the HDRI. With all that being said, you're probably in a pretty good spot. So with D5, we have gone to up here in the right image, and I'm going to make sure then that I'm not on panorama. I'll do a separate video on that later. And we're going to click on image. Here in this section, you have the ability to adjust the field of view and the focal length. Now, technically, these are kind of linked. If by adjusting one, you're going to be adjusting the other. But for an interior shot like this, I found about 35 to be a good starting point. You could take this higher or take it lower. And generally speaking, for exterior shots, I would probably put the focal length down to starting at around 15. Now, we can also then go and adjust the actual preset size. Now, for renders like this, my advice would be, if you're able to do 6K and then maybe downsize it in Photoshop, that's probably what I would recommend. But please note that the gap between a 4K and a 6K render in terms of time is quite substantial. But feel free to experiment and see what works best based on your hardware. In this case, I rendered most of mine out at 4K, and I did ensure that I had the channels option turned on. Now, if you don't see this, this is available for D5 Pro users, and you can turn that on. And it may not be visible, but if we go to preferences, you can turn on the widget. And so under channels, we'll have the option to turn on things like the AO or ambient occlusion. We can also turn on the material ID and reflection layers. And we can also turn on the Z depth if we want to adjust that sort of depth of field a little bit more in Photoshop. On to video. Once I was happy with the overall renders, I decided to add in some video shots. Now, to do this, we just go up to the right and click on Video. And you'll notice on the bottom left of the screen, we have the option for clips. Let's click on clip 1. And I'm going to hit the spacebar. And you can see, hopefully, the shot that is currently set up. So it's a relatively straightforward moving the camera ahead. Now, I'm going to go and create a new one here. So hit this little plus icon, create clip, and this is going to be clip 5. And so when it comes to doing work in D5, my recommendation would be to make multiple clips and try and string them together in your video editing software. Try to avoid having cameras that do a huge amount of sweeping and movement or one long unbroken shot. It might be better to take an approach of effectively show me. In other words, let the viewer watch what's happening, but don't try and move the camera towards the content. So for example, I will now click Add Camera, and I'm going to move this camera just forward ever so slightly, just a little bit, and then I'm going to add a camera. And you can see now we've got 2 separate cameras in different positions. I can adjust the length of time for this shot, so I'm going to put that to 8 seconds, and then I'm going to hit play and just see what happens. And so the camera is going to move forward ever so slowly over the course of the 8 seconds, and it should be relatively nice. You want to again avoid very broad sweeping camera motions here. Try and keep the camera motions to moving forward, or maybe just panning from left to right. You can always adjust the focus. So for example, if I go to, let's see, clip 2 here, now you can kind of see, and I hit play, you can see we're just panning from left to right. There's not a huge amount of camera movement in the shot, and I think overall those will work a lot better than very dynamic camera shots. The other thing to note is on the top right, we have options for ease in and out. I would recommend turning that on. You could leave it as linear or do manual ease in, ease out, but it's easier to just do ease in and out at the same time. So what that will effectively do is sort of smooth out the camera motion. So it'll basically give it a curve. This should be familiar to anyone who's done video editing or animation. Really, you just want to avoid those abrupt changes. So a nice ease in and ease out on the camera motion will give a better result. And for keyframes, I've just put this to auto. We don't really have any movement in this shot other than the camera, so we don't have to worry about the keyframe intervals. We'll leave that for a separate video. Once you're done, we can also then just move ourselves out of the way. And I bumped the resolution to about 2K. Rendering at 4K with D5 is absolutely possible, but you'll want some substantial hardware or be willing to give up quite a lot of time. But for most viewers, a video which is 2K in nature and comprised of multiple different clips should look pretty nice all in all. All right, with that being said, let's take a look at the finished clips and we'll call it pretty quickly. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. Hopefully you found the content interesting and hopefully maybe picked up some advice on a good workflow for both SketchUp and D5 Render. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.